Hi, welcome back to Module 5. We're going to continue to talk a bit about theoretical framework. This module is going to be a bit shorter as we'll briefly be discussing what it looks like if you as an individual want to create your own theoretical framework. I recognize that at this point in your learning process and even maybe your profession, this may be outside your scope. However, I at least want to give you a bit of information so as you begin to move through the profession at some point in time, you may think back to this and go, that makes sense. Enjoy. Have you ever seen an event or happening in the world and you want to go, why does that even happen? How does that happen? When we begin to think about theory development in its simplest form, theory development boils down to this idea of explaining and understanding how and why. So for example, sometimes I think about in my own classroom, why does that happen? And I need an explanation and I need to understand, why does a student do this or why doesn't a student do this? And I can develop some of my own theories the longer I'm involved in the practice. And that's exactly what happens at the core of theory development. It helps us understand, and as we boil down to explain phenomenon, why do we not watch women's sports? Why do we as Americans love potentially football? There's some theories behind this, and we have to recognize that these explanations at times fall upon a continuum, but there's ways that help us understand why these things actually occur. And theory helps us do that. One of the readings for this week's module was done by Janet Fink, and she gave a consideration of how she herself has created theory or developed her own theory. I really like how she broke this down into some simple thoughts and ideas. And as you develop in your profession, and even as an academic, I think you can return to these ideas and find them really helpful. As she indicated, how does she develop theory? She starts with a question of interest. And maybe, let's go back to our previous slide, maybe you want to understand why we don't watch women's sports or why they're not as watched as men's sports. And in doing that, she starts with a question, particularly that is of interest to her. So what interests you? Do you want to understand maybe what is the best way to market a minor league team or so on? And in doing that, then she goes to the literature and she talks about in her article how she extensively reviews the literature, and she does so from a variety of disciplines. So for example, if we're talking about women's sports, yes, she's going to look at the literature from sport management. She's also going to consider it from a psychological lens. She's going to look at those social science literature areas. She's going to look at the sociological literature. And then she's also going to look at the business literature. What are they saying about watching women's sports? And after she's done this extensive review and with her notes as she's made those throughout the process, she'll begin some writing and formulating connections and understanding and based upon, as she indicates, those detailed notes that she took. And then at that point, when she's began her writing process, she'll often return to the literature to consider some more or additional areas. As she's delved into those things, she probably has recognized, as like we do, you go, I need to look that up some more. And then ultimately she returns back to writing. All of this to say, and Fink says this quite well, this process is arduous, it's taxing, but however she finds it, and most of us probably will find it incredibly rewarding, especially if that interest or that question, excuse me, is of interest to us. So is developing theory just for academics? Does it even coincide with those that want to be involved in the profession? Here I want you to think about this idea of theory versus practice. That is, does theory lend towards practice, or does practice lend towards theory? And I think we need to recognize it goes both directions. As some of us, the longer we involved in the profession or the practice, we will recognize and ultimately see theories at work. And it may then be take the part of examining those theories and understanding them to move back towards then how we can guide our practice. I understand that for some of us, theory does not come naturally, or is it even easy? Some of us may find it taxing. I do believe, however, the longer you are involved in the profession, we'll begin to recognize some phenomena and we'll need some explanations. And theory will help us understand those explanations. And then, in turn, those explanations from our theory will then help us begin to practice better. It will improve us as a professional. We then may begin to understand, for example, if we're involved with women's sports, if we understand theoretically why they don't have such a following of men's sports. And then as a person in the practice or a person in that profession, we'll be able to take that theory and say, okay, but here are ways that I can market my women's teams. Here are ways that I can drive attendance for women's sports. And that then is an exact principle of how theory guides practice and practice guides theory. Here we are at the end of Module 5, and it returns us to our idea that I want to encourage you to think about. Good theory leads to good research and good practice, and hopefully you begin to recognize throughout this discussion on even creating your own theory that practice leads to theory and theory leads to practice. That theory is influential. It's helpful for practitioners or those in the field. And those in the field understand how theory plays out. So I want you to recognize as we sum up this concept that they go hand in hand. They're in a circle together. They work together. They feed off of each other. And they're both necessary for your role as a practitioner.